All right. We'll see if anybody joins in. It stopped raining, so some of y'all ought to be outside. Um, well, we're going to start looking at the book of Ruth in a little bit. Hope everybody's doing well, surviving. I saw that saw a thing where like after the quarantines were dropped in certain places in China, it seemed like record numbers of folks were filing for divorce. So, if you're being locked in and we got a few more weeks, I just want to announce now that, I can start making appointments for marital counseling or something if I need to. So, see some folks logging in. Can y'all comment? Just let me know you can hear this, that the sound is picking up. You might prefer it better without the sound. I think that might work. Not seeing any comments. Well, maybe Keelan could tell me, is sound coming through? Ask Keelan if the sound's working. Um, Hope people have been out, found some bears. Um, so obviously Keelan is not watching. Oh, good. There we go. Maybe my comments are delayed. Good. All right. Now Keelan's watching. She wasn't there. All right. We're going to look at Ruth, and was reminding good David that people do come from the book of Ruth now. So going to look at just Ruth 1 through 5. I'm going to read it and start working through some of the things, kind of explain some terms. And this is really just setting up the story. And I think as we go through, it'll become apparent why I'm choosing Ruth. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. And they went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they lived there about 10 years. And both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. And so the setting up of the story is that essentially a Hebrew woman has to go because of a famine, and while there, her sons marry foreign women, and then her husband dies and her sons die, and she's left alone in this foreign country with her 2 daughters-in-law. And we might not pick up some of the things because it's a pretty bleak, dark time. And this is kind of letting us know how difficult it is. The first is in the days when the judges ruled, or really when the judges judged. And if you remember the book of Judges, which precedes this, was a lot of really rough stories. I mean, there were some great heroes of Samson and Deborah. Thank you. And some of the great things they did, but there was also a lot of that's telling us how bad it was. One of the refrains throughout Judges was that there was no king, the people did what was right in their own eyes. And that was always a bad thing, just doing what was right in their own eyes rather than doing what was right in God's eyes. And so there was a lot of immorality. There was corruption in the priesthood. There was corruption with leaders. There was idolatry. There was lots of really rough things going on. And so that's not a time we look at and say, hey, this was when Israel was being godly. This is when the nation was flourishing and doing well. This was a time of darkness and despair. And what was happening was continually the people would be captured by foreign powers. And then God would raise up a judge who would be a hero to deliver them from those powers. And then they would fall back into following their own way and not following God. And so that's kind of the pattern that's going on. And so even in this was also that there was a famine in the land. There was, there wasn't enough food. And, for an agricultural society that didn't have long-term preservation, what you grew was what you would live on. So it very much was your livelihood. And if you didn't see the rain coming and the harvest wasn't coming, you knew you were in trouble, and that you can't last long like that. And so we have this family, Elimelech. That name means God is my king. His wife, Naomi, might be my comfort or a pleasant one. They go with their two sons into Moab. They leave. We'll see how my visuals do here. So Moab is a country that's across the Dead Sea from Judah. So Bethlehem is up here, and then Moab is down here. And it's not just the location. They're close by, but really part of what Moab stands for is enemy of Israel. They're not close, friendly allies. They've been hostile. When Moses led the people out of Egypt through the Exodus, as they came through Moab fought against them. They didn't want them there. They attacked them. And if you remember the story of Balaam, who was called to curse the people, he was hired by Balak, the king of Moab. He was going to be the one who hired to curse the people. They continued to have hostilities between the two nations. And then even in the book of Judges, one of the first powers that overtakes the people is the Moabites. So the Moabites are the ones who subject the people, and so they're not good friends. They're enemies. So they're so desperate they're having to go. This would be like a Scotsman having to go to England to make his livelihood, or think of any traditional rivalry. So he goes with his wife, and what we're being set up for is his death. But we're told they're from Bethlehem in Judah. They're Ephrathites. Ephrath was the name of that region. And you might remember around Christmas we'll read Micah chapter 5, verse 2. You, Bethlehem of Ephrathah, though you were the smallest of the clans of Judah. Talking about the deliverer that's come from there. So if we're reading closely, what we're picking up is it's a small town. It's a small place. Kind of insignificant place, but it is from Judah, and we've known that the prophecy is that a lion from the tribe of Judah will come. We know that the kings are going to come from Judah, and this is setting us up for David and his reign, and ultimately of Jesus, who is King David's greater son. And so, as it kind of reminds us, this little town, but it's also a very significant, important town. It's from the tribe that's going to bring the kings and ultimately the Messiah. So these are the ones. They go, and they mean to stay for just a little bit. They're just going to go to Moab until the rains come, until things are better back home, and they can return. But while they're there, they start to settle in. They're settled in among the foreigners, and the sons take Moabite wives, foreign women, and we're introduced to them, Orpah and Ruth. And what meant to be just a short stay winds up being 10 years. They've settled in there, and then the husband dies, and then the sons die, and so Naomi is now left with her two daughter-in-laws. And she's in a very precarious situation because women at that time didn't have a lot of rights. They were very vulnerable, and especially foreigners. Foreigners were not normally treated well. One of the great things about Israel's law was that it did treat foreigners well. That wasn't the case everywhere. So here she is, and her sons, who would be the ones to provide for her, to take care of her, her husband, who would be the same. They've all gone, and she's just there. And she's there with Orpah and Ruth. and kind of her situation, what we see is a very vulnerable, very weak one. And that's the setup. And really kind of what we're looking at is a very dark time and a very weak place. And that's going to set us up for the story. Now we know the story of Ruth. Ruth accompanies. She goes back as Naomi goes back to Judah. There she's going to marry, she's going to have children, things are going to turn out well. But what I want to just kind of point out with the big themes are, this is a story of how God works in dark times and in times that don't look good, in times that are of fear and of worry and of concern. They're not sure if they're going to have food to come. They're not sure what the future brings. And around them, there's not good leadership. There's not a lot of hope. There's a lot of fear. And this is a story of how God works in that. A lot of times we think if things aren't going well, God must not be at work. But the truth is God's always at work. He's always working out his purpose in dark times as well as good times. And sometimes it seems as though God is especially using the difficult times to do his greatest things. God is working out his plan of redemption in the most unlikely times that we would have thought. But not only that, God is using some very unlikely people. One of the things I love about this story is showing us not great kings, not great armies, not wonderful amazing that are going on, but what God is using is a small family and a pretty weak and vulnerable family through their kindness and goodness to each other to do his work. And I think it's easy for us to look at headlines and look at the big things going on and all the major events of our day and think that that's really where the action is. And I always like to think that if you were reading this Bible story, if you were there at the time, you would never guess that this is where God was working. You would always see that God was working in the great courts, that God was working with the big military leaders, God was working with those who had all the wealth. But the truth is, God's using everything, but God is doing his great work with a family, with a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law and a man they meet who has a field. And so he uses these unlikely people. Matter of fact, even foreign women, Moabites, descendants of those who are Moabites, weren't going to be allowed into the temple. I think for 10 generations, there was this hostility. And so God is even using who they would say are the enemy, who are unclean, who are worshiping false gods. God is using all of these people to work out his purpose. And it's a good reminder that when we think of the big events that, God is doing work in your family. God's doing work in your homes. It's not just the great places. It's these the families that are where God is working out. I better not read comments. Those are very distracting. So and the other thing is, not only is God working in a really difficult time, and God is working with some unlikely people, but he's also working with just simple acts of kindness, of just Ruth staying with Naomi, saying, I'm going to stay with you, I'm going to help you out. God's working with just really simple acts of kindness of actually when Ruth is allowed to pick the grain. When people do the right thing and follow the rules, there's just honesty and decency and goodness, and this goodness is to neighbors and family is the way God is at work. And I think that might be a really good, for us to remember is, as we're in difficult times, as we're in dark times, as we're in fearful times, God is at work through just ordinary people going about their ordinary life, doing the best they can and being kind to one another. And we're going to see all those, and we're going to look at all those events of what they do, of how God uses this ordinariness to bring out the redemption of the world through Jesus by using this ordinary family. But I have a few questions, and I'm not sure if there's a delay with the comment. So I'm gonna raise the question if anybody wants to answer these. If not, these might be good to just write down and think about yourself after we close off. Or if you're with your family, if you want to gather your family around and just have a conversation with yourself with these three questions. And the first one is, with everything going on, and different things going on in your lives, going on around us. What are the big fears and the darkness and the uncertainty that you're struggling with? The second one is thinking of those. What are also the just really simple acts of kindness that you've seen? I'm seeing people sharing things. I'm seeing people kind of go out of their way to entertain really, really bored kids. I'm seeing people doing their best to just support neighbors and one another. What are the little acts of kindness that a year, 2 years now you'll be remembering? And then the final question, kind of with that, is what are ways you can show kindness, maybe particular to your family, to those in your household? The way we have a daughter-in-law showing kindness to her mother-in-law, neighbors showing kindness to them. What are ways we can show kindness to others? I think just a good, helpful thing to ponder. Of how we can reach out to others, how God might be working in our lives. Well, I'm going to close off there. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you want to send message or anything, just kind of helpful things or just kind of things that might be helpful for you, let me know how things are going and let us know how we can serve you. Take care.